This is the podcast for Narrate Church. Narrate Church meets every Sunday at 9 and 11 a.m. at the Grand Street Theater in Helena, Montana. For more information, visit www.narratechurch.org.
The other thing that we tried to point out is the fact that if you were to look back on your life and you were to begin to consider the moments in your life that you most regret, the moments in your life where you've caused others the most pain, the moments in your life where you've said things and done things and spent things, and you just go like the moments where you've done the most destruction behind you, it oftentimes is a negative response to something unexpected. That many of us are very good when we have everything put together and we can think everything through and we can plan everything out. That's the easy part. It's when we miss the flight. It's when they're late. It's when this happens or that happens. That's when life gets hard. And so that's what we really began to wrestle with. The other thing that we pointed out was that, actually the other thing I think is worth saying is we looked at James. Because to me, whether or not you believe the Bible is God's word, that's a process that you have to journey on, whether or not you believe there's something supernatural about it. But there's some things that just affirm its value to me and really draw me to that place of trusting that because it's so insightful. And 2,000 years ago, James was writing to a community of people who were these early Christ followers. And if they were alive today, their story would be on the cover of CNN. Like Anderson Cooper would be doing a feature newscast of them because the injustices that were leveraged in their direction, the mistreatment that they received, it was racist, it was prejudice, it was everything that you could name. And their leader writes to them and is engaging them on the conflict. And he has the audacity to ask two questions. And I just... First of all, respect the fact that they were questions, not statements, because we can all appreciate how much more engaging a question. And he says, what's causing fights and quarrels among you? Go ahead and put that up there. What causes fights and quarrels among you? It's rhetorical. He follows it with, you're thinking, because my wife's an idiot, because my boss is a jerk, because they did this, because something unexpected happened. And he goes, no. Don't they come from the desires that battle within you? In other words, he's saying even if you're only 20% of the problem, your 20% is pretty significant. And that 20%, and then he says it, he just kind of lays it out there. You desire something, but you do not have it, so you kill. You wanted something, you didn't get it. You were expecting something, and something surprising happened. You planned for something, and something didn't come through, and you get torqued. In fact, some historians believe that the killing there was literal. But the point stands that surprises cause us to say things that we would otherwise never say, to think things that we would otherwise never think, to generalize. And do you ever do this where all of a sudden you've got this long paragraph? I mean, you just talked for 5 minutes about something and you've actually never thought about it before, but you're now convinced that you've been thinking about it for years. Do you ever do that? Like you hear someone did something or said something and all of a sudden like your emotions do a 180-degree turn and all of a sudden you've got all these generalizations. That's what James is saying. Like, listen, watch out because you wanted something and you didn't get it and the result was you were willing to kill for it. That surprises cause us to say things we would otherwise not say, to send emails that we would otherwise not send, to do any sort of things. The other thing that we pointed out last week is that knowing that surprises are dangerous is only helpful to the degree that you know one when you see one. And really the big application point from last week was, do you know what they feel like? Because your body physically responds to surprises in predictable fashion. And it varies for all of us. Some of us, we fly off the handle. Some of us, we say things. Some of us, we completely withdraw. Some of us, we go to the bar. I mean, there's a bunch of very, very predictable behaviors that follow an unexpected surprise. And what we said is, hey, it can be really helpful if you know a surprise when you are experiencing one so that you can just close the gap on your responses. It's like knowing that a grizzly bear with 2 little cubs is dangerous, but not knowing what a grizzly bear with 2 little cubs looks like. It's really not all that helpful, right? We were backpacking a couple weeks ago. I talked a little bit about this, and we were with a friend, and our youngest, Justice, he got mosquito bites the first night. By the next morning, as we were hiking out, I mean, they were like the size of quarters. There were these massive things on his shins, which gave Kyle leverage to tease us back, because we tease him because he always wears jeans when he backpacks, and he's like, well, there's why I wear jeans. But we were having lunch, and we were talking about this whole dynamic and the fact that he was itching and all these different things, and at one point, we were like, well, maybe it was poison ivy. And we all kind of went like, what could have been poison ivy? But what quickly came out was we all had 2 things in common. We all understood that poison ivy was terribly uncomfortable and therefore in its own right dangerous. And none of us, is that a bug? Wow. None of us knew what poison ivy looked like. which makes it very unhelpful, right? Great, it's very uncomfortable. Don't know what it looks like. It's very uncomfortable. Don't know what it looks like. So that's what we talked about with surprises is, hey, they're only helpful to the degree that you can identify them. This morning, I want to kind of continue in this dialogue by asking this question, and that's simply this. So what do you do once you know you're in the middle of one? You've identified that something surprised you. You've raised your level of self-awareness, emotional intelligence, all those different things, and suddenly you're like, okay, they said something, I'm surprised. That happened, I'm surprised. Like whether it's in like 30 seconds later or 3 minutes later or whatever, but you've identified it, then what do you do? Something you've entirely, that is entirely shocking, that you didn't plan for whatsoever. What do you do then? As I was studying this, and I talked a little bit about, this very much is a series born out of Adam's greatest weaknesses. So if you're looking for ammo on me, like I'm going to give you lots of it over the course of this series, and if you know me, then I don't need to give you any more ammo because this is me at my worst. And as I was studying this, going all the way back to January, I found myself asking questions like, what do the best parents do? Like when they're surprised and their kid does something shocking, what are the guidelines for what good parents do there? And I know those are dangerous terminology, but you're with me, right? Like, not trying to shame anybody, but like, what's the wise thing to do there? Those spouses that I most respect their interactions, what do they do? My friends that are the most adaptable, like, what do they do? I even think on a business kind of leadership level, there's this legitimate question of what do the most creative people in the world do when they're surprised? Like, how do they handle that? Because I quickly got to the point where I could identify that I was dealing with a surprise, and yet I was still the village idiot while I was dealing with it, because I just didn't know what to do. One example that kind of reminded me of just how much I struggle with this going back to last fall, the staff approached me about their desire to have a kind of an all-skate Christmas party. What I mean by that is, in the past, the kids team would have a Christmas party for their volunteers, and the band and tech team would have a Christmas party for their volunteers, and the guest services team would have a Christmas party for their volunteers. But they had kind of decided that they wanted to pool their resources and pool their energy and pool their creativity, and they wanted to have one Christmas party. Which, and to add to that, they weren't just talking, Pizza Hut in someone's basement. They wanted to rent a really nice venue, and they wanted to do really nice food, and they really wanted to do really something classy for those of you that are part of those Sunday morning teams, just to say thanks and to build community, because that's what we say that you get when you serve with us. Well, there's a couple of red flags that kind of rose to the surface for me, and I feel like at that point in the creative process, my role was to ask the hard questions. And the thing that stood out to me the most was the danger of not inviting people. The danger of one of you who is very much a part of Narrate, and this is your church, and we are your family, and all those different things, and we work really hard to say that you belong at the level you want to belong, and to not create those unhealthy rings of belonging. But what happens then when one of you who isn't on one of those teams is walking down Last Chance Gulch, and you happen upon this place where you see all these Narrate people, and they're having a good time, and you quickly come to the realization that there's a party with a bunch of Narrate people, and you weren't invited? That was a scary proposition to me. And I'm not kidding when I say we literally spent hours over a couple meetings working through nuances like that. The other thing that really bothered me was we say we're a community that scatters and gathers. And in some ways, having a Christmas party for people who help us gather, but not ones who help us scatter, is somewhat hypocritical, because we're not celebrating the people who help us scatter all the time. And so these are the type of questions that we came up with. And what it really led to was a very thorough conversation of making sure we were being really wise with regards to who was invited and who wasn't, and all those kind of gross details that it's kind of a catch-22 situation, right? In the end, I said, yeah, let's do it. And they ran with it and ultimately set the table for a really neat event. And I think it was the night before, it was definitely the week of, my wife was working, I was up late, I got a text on my phone from Sarah, and it said something to the effect, I knew that her and Tom were working at the time on getting foster kids in their home, which is heroic in its own regard, and that they were, they hadn't had that, and they'd been hoping for that for months. And I knew that week they were meeting with a gal who was a prospective foster student. She was a high school student, and so the text said, hey, essentially it said, we met the gal, it went really, really good. I invited her to the Christmas party tomorrow, which isn't that big a deal, right? But it was if you're me, because instantly I thought, well, we set all kinds of rules and guidelines for who's going and who's not, and you just broke all of them. And not only that, he didn't even ask. He didn't ask me, he didn't ask the other staff members. And what followed was this somewhat tense interaction between Sarah and I, and it's part of what I love working with her is because her and I, we just kind of move into conflict. We don't avoid it. But it was a pretty tense interaction between the two of us going back and forth about me saying stupid stuff and her saying smart stuff and me saying ungracious stuff and her saying gracious stuff. And it was just this interaction we had. And by the next morning, I don't know that you have this experience, but I have it often. It was the next morning I woke up and instantly wanted to go sit in a circle with my friends and raise my hand and say, "Hi, my name's Adam. I'm a complete control freak and a jerk." You just came to the realization oh, I did it again. Just completely overreacted, completely handled that situation wrong. And it was really from that I found myself going okay, James, thank you. Thanks that you point out the fact that not getting my way is dangerous, but what do I do? What principle guides me in the moment when I'm chock full of adrenaline and all kinds of emotion, good and bad, and I'm completely caught off guard and I can't plan for it because that's my strength. What do I do then? What principles can I utilize? What do the smart people do? What do the adaptable people do? What do the creative people do? And it actually led me to a pretty general study of the Scripture, which is always inconvenient when you do what I do because general studies of the Scripture take hours, not minutes, and you don't like them. But it led to this basic general observation that I'm going to unpack it from a couple spots in the text. It was basically this, that throughout the Scriptures, God demonstrates that if we form the habit of treating every unexpected event as a threat, if we get in the habit of treating every surprise as a bad thing, if we default to negative, if we assume that the outcome is always going to be worse, then among a whole bunch of other things, one very safe thing to say is we really pave the way to miss God. Because God doesn't always obey our rules. He doesn't always stick with our plans. And that if we're a people who is praying for a living, dynamic God to guide and lead us, then we have to learn to greet surprises differently. One place this stands out most vividly to me is a classic story that Jesus tells about the Good Samaritan. Now, mind you that the Good Samaritan is our phrase, not theirs, because in their day, Good Samaritan would have been the epitome of an oxymoron. That culture could not have comprehended, that Jewish culture, that a Samaritan could be good. I suppose there's people in our world today who would be likened to saying a good Muslim. That would just so great at everything that culture was about. They would assume that wasn't even possible. And thus, Jesus goes after it. Now, the context here is Jesus, he's not running for president, but when you read his interactions with the people in control, that's kind of the way you can read them. Because what's going on here is Jesus is having an interaction with the guy who calls himself an expert in the law. And really what that means is here's a guy who had power. He had lots of power. And what we find out throughout the course of Jesus' life is it didn't matter even if Jesus rose from the dead, that he was not going to believe in Jesus because he had too much to lose personally. There's its own sermon. And so this guy, he's asking Jesus questions, but it's kind of like when you would watch the debates, the Obama-Romney debates, because everybody's smiling and everyone's acting like they're good friends and they're asking these questions that sound very kind, but really what they're hoping for is, and what he's hoping for is to get Jesus to say something that he can put on the cover of the paper and his election campaign will completely be sabotaged. And so he asked Jesus, and it's hard for us to appreciate the complexity of the question, but these guys worked so hard on their religiosity. He asked Jesus, hey, so what's really required to love God? And it's hard for us to appreciate just how complex that was because for a good Jewish person, everything they did was dictated by that question. And Jesus throws up an answer that I think must have come across as very curt. And he says, well, love the Lord your God with all your strength, with all your mind, with all your soul, with every part of your being, and love your neighbor as yourself. And oh, by the way, you can't separate those two. If you've been to church more than 3 times in your life, you've kind of been inoculated from the incredible, vivid nature of that statement because we've heard it so much. But then the guy says, so who's my neighbor? I mean, that's the Democrat question to the Republican or the Republican, whichever side you're on. That's ha, gotcha. And Jesus sets up a story. Now, the story has a man coming from Jerusalem to Jericho, and on his way, he's taken over by bandits. He's beaten to complete unconsciousness. He's completely stripped of everything, and then he's left there for the dead. And as he's lying on this somewhat narrow road, a very steep, rugged terrain, some people come along. The first one, Jesus says, a priest happened to be going down the same road. And when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So the priest is coming along, and he sees the disaster up ahead. He sees the messiness of it, and he gives it as big he avoids it to the fullest degree. Jesus continues. So to a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. Some think that maybe even the Levite was following his lead. I mean, these are temple people, these are religious people, these are important people, these are respectable people. He does the same thing, not going there. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He actually noticed him. He actually felt something when he saw him. He wasn't so completely numb to the situation, but it didn't stop there. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. So the Samaritan, he takes care of him. He financially invests in his care. He emotionally invests in his care. He takes his day and takes care of him. He gets him to the hospital or the closest thing to, and even says, hey, listen, I'll pay the medical bills when the dust settles. Just do what the guy needs. And then Jesus, in a way that kind of makes you proud to follow him in this like this ninja battle that he's having, he says, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? And the crowd goes, gotcha. And the man so hates Samaritans. Look at the way he says it. The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. He wouldn't even say the guy's name. And Jesus says, go and do likewise. Now, let me ask you this. There's a lot that these 3 guys don't have in common. There's something that they do. What do they all have in common, circumstantially? What do each one of these people share in common with regard to that day in history, which wasn't for them a day in history, it was a day in their life? Precisely. They were all surprised. All of them had something completely unexpected happen to them. 2 of them couldn't deal with it. 2 of them, I want to argue, assumed it as a problem. Their default was, this wasn't expected, therefore it doesn't fit within the scope of my day, therefore it must be an interruption, therefore it must be from the evil one, therefore I don't have to do it. 2 of them treated it as an absolute problem. 1 of them, I'm going to argue, saw it as an opportunity. 1 of them, and I don't know if he had done this thorough study on surprises himself, but 1 of them had the disposition that involved his ability to see a surprise, experience a surprise, and not default to this is bad, this is the end of the world, I'm going to hate the rest of my life, everything's worse from now on, like it's all downhill from here. 1 of them was able to shut down from that emotional roller coaster and go, wow, what do I do here? Now, to be sure, the takeaway that Jesus is getting at here is your neighbor is not someone of a specific religion or ethnicity. They're not created by geographic location or hair color or age or gender or any of those different things. A neighbor is someone whom you happen upon. A neighbor is someone who ends up in your path. But can't we say that to really live that out requires a disposition that treats surprises a little bit differently than someone like me? I was wrestling with this, and actually right now I'm reading through the infancy narratives, the Christmas stories over and over and over again, because one of the tricky things about my job is every December you got to come up with something new to say, and there's nothing new to say, and so I just get in this habit of reading it for about a month and just going like, Lord, what thread do you want us to pull on? And I was doing that this week, and something popped out to me actually in Matthew's narrative. Something about Joseph's disposition towards surprises. Watch this. This is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. Surprise! Your fiance's pregnant. Oh, and she's telling you that she didn't sleep with another man, that God did it to her. Surprise! Because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace. I'm sure you know this, but parenthetically, he didn't want to get her killed because that was the legal mandate of the situation. Watch the way that the text says this. He had in mind to divorce her quietly. Just thinking about it. I think moving slow, processing the situation, taking it in, hitting pause, going, okay, surprise, like my plans have been derailed. What do I do now? And then it continues. But after he had considered this, like, do you see the language? The slowness of his response? The intentionality? After he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, which creates theological constructs for the fact that it really is true that sleeping on it is a really good practice. Even if God doesn't speak to you in the middle of the night. Like, what if Joseph treated surprises as bad? What if he defaulted to, they're all interruptions. They're all the evil one. Like, they're always, always, always bad. Or don't stop with Joseph. Well, what if Abram, back before he was called Abraham, back when he was just another guy in a large tribe of a nation that didn't follow God, and God said to him, hey, Abram, I want you to leave here. Yeah, that place where you're comfortable and everything's secure and everything's going well. I want you to leave here and I want you to go there. And oh, by the way, just an audible voice out of nowhere. What if Abram was so closed to surprises? Or Moses, burning bush, talking to you. I mean, what if, and do you see how when you start studying this out, you just go like, wow, one narrative after another in the scriptures it involves a person who had a plan, and that plan was interrupted, and God was a part of the interruption. It was actually better because of the interruption. One of my very favorite leadership minds, a guy named Jim Collins, he said in an interview recently with a guy named Ken Coleman, he said, what I've learned in studying people is that we're not risk adverse. We're not risk adverse, we're ambiguity adverse. See, we don't hate risking failure. We hate unknown. And that's what a surprise is. A surprise is you are smack dab in the middle of something that you can't see the end of. You don't know the outcome. And thus the emotional reactions that come with it. And you know something? Physically, biologically, scientifically, neurologically, your brain loathes surprises. I don't care how spontaneous of a person you are, your brain hates them. There are things that it even does with your own eyesight to fill in the blank before your brain is actually even registered. Like, did you know there's a black spot in your sight? And what it does is it fills in the blank. There's a book written by a guy named Gregory Burns, and we've talked about it before, and it is a fantastic book. We just grabbed a few and threw them over there if you want to read it. It's a book called Iconoclast, and what he asks is, what keeps the most creative people in the world creative? And he's a neuroscientist. Like, he's not a painter, none of that. He's a neuroscientist, and it's a very fun read. He talks about how what those people do is they approach the unexpected differently. In fact, they go looking for it. In fact, they see it as a resource. A few years ago actually, it was our first fall together as a church, and I suppose it was in about October or so. One of the conversations that I created with the council is, guys, what are we going to do by way of Christmas bonuses for the staff? Now, again, context is everything. I came from a church in Billings where the council consistently leveraged pretty generous bonuses for the staff. And I don't know what the rubric was or any of that, but that was my only experience. And so as we moved into October, coming up into our first year, I just was asking the council, like, guys, what are we going to do? And we had a very good conversation, and what we realized through the course of that conversation was, like, we were hemorrhaging money like crazy. And that wasn't entirely unexpected. I mean, it wasn't desired, but it wasn't entirely unexpected. And so we, at the time, were working really hard to do everything we could to be as wise as we could and as faithful as we could to make sure that we were actually a church next year. So the idea of a Christmas bonus quickly became kind of silly. And we just collectively agreed, like, no, Adam's going to go tell the staff that we love you and we appreciate you, and we're going to try to do all kinds of things to express that. But in the name of you having a job next year, you're not going to get a Christmas bonus. They didn't really expect anything, so that wasn't a very dramatic experience. The next weekend was the last weekend before Christmas Eve, and there was this family who has been so key from the very beginning. And they walked up to me, and they handed me a card, and I think I knew at the time that they weren't going to be here for Christmas Eve services, and when I got home later, I opened up the card, and in it was a check written out to me, and in the memo it said, Merry Christmas. And I immediately knew what I was going to do. I was going to sign the back of the thing and throw it in the general offering, and because I felt like my integrity was on the line, and the council decided we weren't going to do Christmas bonuses, and so that was going to be that. And the only question that remained for me was, how do I handle this with regard to them? because I'm so grateful and for them, and even in that moment, do I tell them that's what I've done, or do I just say, hey, thanks, and leave that information unknown? So I wrestled with that quite a bit. And at one point, I still remember I was standing in Dillard's looking for my Christmas Eve shirt, because something about Christmas Eve is just so stressful, and it always leads to my feeling like I need to break up the every 4-week rotation a little bit. So I kind of spontaneously decided that I was going to call my friend Vern, who leads Harvest in Billings, the guy who I worked for a long time and is one of the better leaders I've ever known. And I just said, okay, so I kind of quickly told Vern the situation. So what do I do? And he said, like a good rabbi, he said, Adam, someone came up to me last week. They handed me a $1,000 check, and they named a pastor on the staff, I won't name him, who had helped them with their marriage. And this guy so wanted to thank that pastor for the effort that he had put forth in helping them save their marriage, that he wanted them to have this money, but he didn't want them to know that the money came from him, and so he was giving me or giving Vern the money so that Vern would in turn write a different check that went anonymously to this guy and his staff. He said, Adam, what do you think I did? I already knew what he did, because that's what I do. I know things. Because I knew that we come from a context where we don't do designated giving. Like, we put a lot of value in the general fund, and we want to help people understand that the council works hard and the staff gets generous budgets, and so we don't need to do fundraisers for Super Summer Camp, and we don't need to do that stuff. And I knew that in a week from then, this guy would be getting a budgeted Christmas bonus. And so in my head, I went, well, I think you probably put it in the general offering, and went to your head like he's going to get a Christmas bonus here in another week. Thank you for contributing to the general fund. Nope, he said. I said, so I think you probably told him no. Nope, he said. Nope. Obviously, eventually he got me to the point where he said, Adam, I did it. It's like, you what? No, you can't. Like, that defies everything you taught me. You can't do that. He said, Adam, that has never happened before. Like, I've been leading this place for 10 years. I've been around church, leading in church for 20 years. I've never had that happen before. And then he said it. And this was this principle that I think can drive us through surprises. He said, Adam, when something happens that I didn't expect, I work really hard to not treat it as a problem until there's a theme. This was entirely unprecedented, Adam. It's never happened before. So therefore, I'm just going to assume that the Lord was doing something. I'm just going to assume that God is doing something, and for me to get in the way of that is just to get in the way of God. And then he said, now, if a week from now or even a month from now it happens again, now I'm thinking a little more clearly on this one. And if it happens a third time in the foreseeable future, now I'm probably getting together the team, and we're probably starting to talk policy and those types of things. He said, but until there's a theme, I assume there's no problem. You see how that could be a game changer? Like, what if you greeted surprises? Now, I understand that we could all come up with hypothetical situations that would be a stupid suggestion. I think Caleb talked really well a couple weeks ago about the moral will of God and some of those different issues. But what if your posture towards the unexpected could flip-flop, and you would adapt an attitude that says, I'm going to assume this is actually an opportunity. I'm going to assume that God is actually doing something here. And I don't think that it requires that you necessarily start talking like a church person all the time and saying those, offering all those empty platitudes. But what if you were just to assume, I'm just going to kind of see what the Lord might be doing here. I'm going to assume that this might actually lead to something good. And you know something? Move the spiritual conversation off the table. The most creative people in the world, you know what they do? They welcome surprises. Like, in the daily monotony, they're not any more creative than you and I are. What the difference between the most creative people and you and I, or maybe you're creative and that's offensive, whatever. The difference between the most creative people and the normal non-creative people is the creative people, they actually learn to embrace surprises, the unexpected. They leverage it. They use it. They get inside of it. They wrestle with it. The best songs, the best paintings, the best organizations, the best nonprofits, the best ideas, they're rarely mapped out and strategically planned, are they? They happen upon us, and we embrace them. The best parents, they embrace surprises. The best spouses, the most adaptable people, they just get rid of the posture. It doesn't even mean that they don't have to return to it the next day and go, you know what, I don't know about this. But it does mean that their first default disposition isn't to assume it's bad. See, what stood out to me is that when we are facing and dealing with a surprise, we really have a couple options. You can be God of your life, and you can make everybody play by your rules and your designs and your ideas, or you can step into relationship with a dynamic, living God who we know some things about, but let's be honest, we don't know a lot more than we do. A God who moves and shapes and leads and does things and sometimes even answers prayer, even though we don't recognize it as such. You can make the world play by your rules, or you can embrace surprises and leverage them. Now, do you have that little notebook? Did you get the notebook when you walked in? Will you grab that? Because here's what I want you to do with that. How many of you, I'm just going to keep talking and you just write as I babble, but can you think of a situation that when it happened, it was the end of the world? Can you think of a job you didn't get, a house that didn't sell, a relationship that ended, that when it happened, I don't know, without making light of it, maybe you were literally suicidal. A situation that when you happened, you thought that you had reached your crescendo of happiness, it could never get any better. You thought the world was over. You thought your dreams were dead. Can you think of a situation that was so bad when it transpired, and yet today you wouldn't undo it for all the money in the world? Can you think of one of those? Just take some notes, will you? And just jot a few of those down. Here's my challenge to you this week. Because really this series is about self-awareness. It's about emotional intelligence. Here's my challenge to you, is to over the course of the next week and over maybe even the next month, to keep this thing with you and to journal the surprises. Just jot them down. Maybe you start your day or end your day by taking a couple-minute inventory of when was I surprised? Whether your food was cold at the restaurant, or someone lost a job, or the health diagnosis was bad. No matter how huge or minor, just journal them. Because I think what can happen if you'll do that, and it's been something that I've been doing for a while now, what can happen is you'll begin to be able to look back, and you'll be confronted with the fact that most of the surprises weren't the end of the world. Most of them led to some really good things. Most of them, now you can see God's hand in them. Let's just talk about the band thing. We planned for her to be here March 1st. It's July 21st. And yet you don't even want me to start on all the neat things that happened between Caleb and Sarah and Bridget and myself and the team and the band. And we could just go on for hours. Now, is that spin doctrine? I guess we all have to pay our fee there. But what if you were to begin to track the surprises, even the ones that in the moment you hate, and then periodically flip backwards and begin to consider, wow, maybe I'm being emotional. Maybe if that one wasn't the end of the world, this one wasn't. Maybe if that relationship or that business situation or just on and on and on and on. Let me end with this. I was listening recently to a podcast with Andy Stanley on leadership, and he was talking about something central to their organizational culture, and that was that he's worked really hard on something that we would in our culture call having a high view of people. And what he means by that is when there's a gap to be filled in, and this is the way he talked about it, when there's a gap to be filled in, you assume the best, not the worst. When someone's 5 minutes late, you don't assume that they suddenly hate you or that they hate their job. You assume that something unexpected happened. When there's something that could cause you to either assume the worst about someone or assume the best about them, you assume the best. And you don't need me to tell you how hard it is to create that kind of culture within an organization, and yet that was what he talked about. And then he said, and the way he talked about it was filling in the gap. How do you fill in the gap? How do you fill in the gap? How do you fill in the gap? And then what he said was that when filling in the gap positively is too hard, that's when you need a conversation. Like when you're struggling too much to give them the benefit of the doubt, that's when you got to sit down. When you're having the conversation in your head and you're rehearsing the conversation over and over and over again, that's when you need to sit across them and go, listen, you've been 5 minutes late for this meeting for a month straight now, and I kind of am starting to feel like you don't value this job anymore, but I don't know, is that true? That's when we need the conversations. And as I was listening to him talk about that, I thought, wow, this is exactly what we're talking about. What we're talking about when you deal with a surprise is filling in the gap, assuming the best, not the worst. The best about them, and if you're a God-fearing, God-follower person, or even just a spiritual person, or even a Jesus-following person, it also applies to God, doesn't it? To begin to assume, like, Lord, this stinks. There's no other way to spin it. But I'm going to fill in the gap, that it's you. I'm going to assume the best about you. And sometimes I'm going to find that difficult to do. And so it's going to take some prolonged walking and some prolonged time on my knees and some prolonged conversation with you to work out the fact that you're still good and still in control. So I don't know. But what if? What if the way you began to deal with surprise in the moment was to work hard to develop a posture to begin to say, I'm not going to assume it's a problem until I have a theme. I'm actually going to assume it's an opportunity. And if you're someone here this morning and you struggle tremendously with the notion of God, the idea of God, maybe your life circumstances make the idea of embracing a God who's good and in control and pays attention really, really difficult, let me just challenge you here. What if you were just to assume the best about God for a week? Just fill in the blank differently for a week and see. See where that leads you. See how that impacts your life. See how that might change your thinking about him. Because you don't need me to tell you that if you assume the worst in someone, you're going to find it. And maybe that explains your spiritual experience. Maybe it's been sullied, it's been soured, it's been tainted by the fact that you're always looking for the evidence that he's not. And you fail to deal honestly with the evidence that he is. That doesn't mean that the evidence that he's not, it goes away. But at least he gets a more fair hearing.
For more information on Narrate Church, visit www.narratechurch.org or download the mobile app, now available for iPhone and Android.